It's a great pleasure, and I'm actually a bit quite honored to have as guest Professor Rachael Jack in this, that is the second meeting of the Sciences of the Face webinars. Just a bit of context. I'm Marco Viola, I'm a postdoc in the University of Turin, and I'm part of the ERC project FACES, standing for Face Aesthetics in Contemporary E-Technological Societies. The PI of this ERC project, Professor Massimo Leone, is the leading expert in semiotics, but he was willing to investigate the face and what the face mean or might mean from many perspectives, including cognitive science. And so, as many of you know, I've organized this series of webinars with some of the most relevant researchers in the fields of face perception, broadly construed from many disciplines. And today, we have the pleasure to have Professor Rachael Jack from the University of Glasgow. Professor Jack's lab has been, I think I'm not overestimating the influence of her work on the cultural specificity of immersion. While I was reading her papers, I thought she unraveled the middle point between universality and culturalists on the facial expression of emotion, and she did it with a clever methodology of which I don't want to anticipate too much in order not to make too many spoilers. Professor Rachael Jack is an associate professor, and she has many papers in some of the most relevant journals in social psychology and neighboring disciplines. I think that I cannot make any introduction which makes the right honor to our guests, so I'd rather let her speak, and I will thank her once more for accepting our invitation. So I'm now switching you to the presenter mode and shutting up myself.
Okay, well, thanks, Marco, for inviting me to this really, really interesting set of talks. And thanks to everybody who's come along to this talk today. As Marco mentioned, I'm a professor of computational social cognition, and my research program primarily focuses on understanding facial expressions of emotion, but also other social messages, and how these are similar and different across cultures, understanding the universal components, but also the cultural specificities. And we have used a data-driven method to build these models and to examine them for these similarities and differences. And so this is a method that I would like to present to you today. So there's going to be three main parts to this talk. The first part is really understanding, why should we study facial expressions? And because most people believe that facial expressions are universal, there's a large set of the literature which claims that facial expressions are universal, and in day-to-day life and in effective computing and so on, it's largely believed that facial expressions are universal. So why should now we spend time and effort trying to understand cultural nuances? The second part will focus really on the data-driven method that we've been using to model facial expressions, and how that data-driven method takes understanding facial expressions beyond its traditional boundaries and enables us to understand a lot more about facial expressions than some of the methods used in earlier studies. This is really due to technological and methodological developments. We're very lucky to be living at this time to have these, of course. Part three, of course, then will be just presenting some of the main results from the lab that we've acquired using this data-driven method. And again, looking at cross-cultural similarities and what are the differences also in facial expression communication and how this potentially can impact psychological theories, but also can have other applications outside of psychology, such as in affective computing, such as the design of digital agents, because we need digital agents to be able to generate facial expressions that are realistic, believable, and that accurately communicate emotion messages in different cultures. So these will be the three main parts I'll cover today. Okay, so we're all social creatures, and of course, we all sort of intuitively know that facial expressions are a very powerful social stimulus. Facial expressions are a really powerful tool to communicate social messages, and a very, very wide range of social messages, emotions, all of the range of emotions, but they can also convey perceptions of different personality types, different mental states, such as confused or bored during a conversation, and so on. And the reason why the face, the human face, is a really powerful social tool to communicate these messages is because some of the individual face movements, such as showing the eye whites or nose wrinkling or a big broad smile, these are all really very visually salient. They're very salient to the human visual brain, because these features excite some of the sensitivities of the human brain, such as its sensitivity for contrast and so on. So the face movements that are made, they're very salient, they really grab attention. Another reason why the human face is so so powerful as a social tool is that it can generate a very, very high number of different social messages. And the reason why it can do that is because it's comprised of a number of independent facial muscles. So the human face has roughly, let's say, about 40 independent muscles that can be activated independently. They can be combined in different ways, as you can see here, to create a really vast number of different complex dynamic patterns, which we would, call facial expressions. So the capacity of the human face to create facial expressions is huge. And so as a result, it's able then to transmit a very wide range of social messages. So the facial expressions are really, really powerful for humans. Now, one of the main challenges then has been to understand, in amongst all of this complexity, all of these different facial expressions the human face can make, which ones are meaningful, which ones are understandable across different cultures, which ones are culturally specific. Now that's very, very challenging, because the human face and all its complexity it's a vast place to search for meaning. And so it's really a bit like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Which one of all these thousands is, a universal signal of happiness? And I think this is summed up really nicely by Labar in 1947. And he said that in the language of gesture all over the world, there are varying mixtures of the physiologically conditioned response, which is what is cross-cultural, and the purely cultural one. So that's what is culture specific. And it is frequently difficult to analyze out and segregate the two. Now, this is as true now as it was then, and it really illustrates very well the real challenge of understanding exactly which face movements are meaningful in different cultures. So, as many of us know, one of the most sort of notable research programs in tackling this really big research question is Ekman and colleagues. And so what they did, their approach was to select a set of photographs of facial expressions that they hypothesized represented different basic emotions. So happy, surprise, fear, disgust, anger, and sad, which are shown here. They took these photographs and then they showed them to people in countries across the world, Papua New Guinea, Brazil, Japan, the United States, and so on. And they asked people if they could recognize them. And what they found is that people could, by and large, recognize these facial expressions. And as a result of these studies, they reported that these six specific facial expression patterns are the universal language of emotion. And after that, these particular images became the gold standard in research. And so the story goes that you couldn't get published unless you used these standardized gold standard universal facial expressions, and that has continued for quite some time. So if we take a closer look at the data, though, we find that there's some limitations or some issues with these data in terms of universality, and also reflects that knowledge of facial expression so far has remained somewhat limited. And this has also been limited by technological and methodological advancements. So first of all, and I should also point out that one thing that's really important is in the method that Ekman and others have used, they were using perception to understand production. And so this is based on the thinking that if somebody recognizes a facial expression, that facial expression is likely to be produced in their culture. And this is based on Darwin's observation. Darwin was an evolutionary biologist, and he observed that one of the leading principles which have determined the chief movements of expression is the recognition of expression. So he was amongst the first to outline the intimate link between production and perception and a co-evolution of signaling. So production and perception are intimately linked. And that is why a lot of studies looking at facial expressions use perception to understand production. So if we look then at the history of these judgment studies, as they're called, these recognition studies using these standardized facial expressions, what we find, rather than a universal recognition, is that we in fact find substantial cultural variance in recognition accuracy. And this is depicted here in this image. So if we take all the papers from 1969, Ekman's seminal science paper, all the way to reasonable present day, using these facial expression stimuli, we can find substantial cultural variation. Each point here on this map represents the average recognition performance for each of the different facial expressions of emotion within the geographical region. So reds and purples indicate high accuracy, blues and greens indicate low accuracy. Anything that's outlined in black is anything that's below 75%, which would generally be considered typical recognition performance, sort of using clinical samples. So if we went around recognizing buses and various other things in environment at 70%, 60, 70%, anything lower than that, we would have a problem. It would be very dangerous. So you can see here there's quite a lot of cultural variation. Now you might ask, well, why did they then report universal recognition? And the answer is very simple, is that they used a rather liberal threshold. That the standard at the time was to use above chance performance. Now, above chance performance can be a useful threshold. If it's above chance performance, there's definitely something going on. In the particular tasks that all of these papers used, they were all 6 alternative force choice tasks, which means when you categorize the stimulus, you have a choice of 6. You can only choose across 6. So that means chance performance is around about 17%. So if a participant got above 17%, then it was considered recognized. As I've just said, if we were recognizing things about 20%, it would be clear that we would have a problem with recognizing that object, for example. So in using a rather liberal threshold, that meant that any cultural differences would have been masked. And if we look again at these data, we do find statistically significantly different results, recognition accuracy across cultures. And as I say, those had largely been masked with using this liberal threshold. That's the reason why they've been reported as universal. So then this raises an important question. If these particular facial expressions of emotion are not recognized outside of, say, Western culture, so the image before showed that recognition accuracy is largely quite high in Western culture and lower in East Asian culture. If these facial expressions are not recognized in East Asian culture, then which facial expressions do communicate these emotion messages? There must be some facial expressions that do this. So which ones are they? So another limitation of the approach that they used is that it introduces what we might call a sort of compound sampling bias. So let me illustrate here. If we imagine that this circle represents all of the facial expressions the human face can make. And the approach that they used of hand selecting a set of 6 facial expressions, they first of all only look at 6 basic emotions when we know that there's a very wide variety of other emotions that humans convey and represent. They also selected these images, these facial expressions, in a top-down manner. So what do I mean by that? So this means that you have the experimenters who are subjective human beings, they're Westerners, and they are selecting facial expressions that they think could represent these emotions in other cultures. So there's a large subjective component to that. So these were really hand-selected images. Another limitation, of course, is that these images are static. They don't contain any potentially useful dynamic information, which could be very important in conveying emotions, and some of those temporal dynamics may differ across cultures, or they might be similar. So these are static images. They don't have that kind of information. So the representation of these emotions as signals is somewhat limited. And in doing so, this limits our knowledge of facial expressions, which ones are similar and different, and how are they represented as face movements. However, the good news, of course, is that with technological and methodological advancements, we're now at this very exciting juncture where we can explore more the full range of facial expressions and understand them much more in their complexity, including cultural similarities and their differences. So this is a method that I would like to share with you today. This is a method that we've been developing in Glasgow. This was a method that was initially developed many decades ago, before my time, but has been consistently developed, particularly within the vision sciences, to be applied to social signals more recently. Social signals, as I've explained, are very complex, and this particular approach makes that problem tractable. So let me explain. Let me give you some illustrations. So let's say that you encounter this person and you are trying to interpret how they feel. So you might think that this person is angry or disgusted. Most people think that they're maybe angry or disgusted. And that's because they're making a facial expression which you might find familiar. It's something that you know and that you can readily label. Now, how about this other person? So most people don't really know anything about this facial expression. It's not very familiar. It's quite difficult to interpret. They don't readily label this facial expression. Now, the psychophysical twist here, because we're using a psychophysical method, is that both of these facial expressions were just randomly generated. So unlike previous methods, I did not hand select these facial expressions, neither did anybody else. They're just randomly generated. And then what we do is that we use the perception, the subjective perception of the participant in a culture, not the experimenter, but a participant in a culture. We use their subjective perception to then understand which face movements in all this variety of face movements elicits this perception in a given individual. So this is a bottom-up, data-driven approach where the experimenter is agnostic to the facial expressions that will convey which emotions to whom, or maybe they express nothing. And critically, we use the subjective perception of the participant to essentially find the needle in the haystack that I referred to before. Okay, so let me just run through a trial. How did we create these facial expressions and so on? So we create these random facial expressions using a dynamic face movement generator that was developed by my colleagues in Glasgow. This face movement generator comprises a library of action units. So action units are these individual face movements that I showed you earlier. There's about 40 of them or so. And what they did is that they recruited a set of specially trained individuals who can move each one of these action units on their face individually. It's very difficult to do this. They're specially trained. So, for example, they can lower one eyelid at a time without moving the rest of their face. So we asked these people to move each one of the action units on their face, and then we recorded their face with a stereoscopic system, which allows us to have a 3D representation of each individual action unit. So this library of action unit patterns. We can then apply a dynamic movement to each action unit individually. So we have full control over each individual action unit and its movements. We can then combine these action units together. We can combine these action units together to create almost any facial behavior. Okay, so on each experimental trial, the platform randomly selects a subset of action units, maybe one or between 1 and say 4 or 5 individual action units. It selects a subset of these and it applies a dynamic movement to each individual action unit, as showed earlier with the color-coded curves. Then these action units are combined together to produce a random facial animation. So again, we're just agnostically selecting facial expressions, if you like. Then we show it to the participant who's naive, and we ask them to categorize the facial animation according to, for example, in this case, the 6 classic emotions. If we're interested in modeling facial expressions of the 6 classic emotions here, we use these labels simply. Now, the participant will only choose a label if and only if the facial animation, that emotion label, if they perceive that emotion, they choose the label. If it doesn't correspond to any of these labels, we ask them to choose other. So we only want them to choose a label if they recognize this as a given facial expression. Everything else, they can just see other. Okay, so this means that after many such trials, so each participant does a lot of trials because we have a huge space to search, to explore. After many such trials, we can build a statistical relationship between the action units that were presented on each trial and the participants' responses. So, for example, if the eye whites, when they're present in the facial animations, the participant may categorize these animations as fear with very, very high frequency. That means that when the action unit is present, it is eliciting a given perception in a participant. So we can really build a relationship. When this action unit was present, or these combinations of action units, when they were present, what did the participant say? It's really a basic building of a statistical relationship between what we present and what the participant responds. This then enables us to build a model of each facial expression, a dynamic, statistically robust model of each facial expression that corresponds to each of these emotion messages. And we do this for each individual observer. The reason why we do this for each individual rather than an average is so that we can capture and estimate and examine population variance. We expect there to be variance within a population. We want to know about that variance. We want to be able to examine it to understand population variance. It also enables us to demonstrate replication of results across n participants, for example. The important thing here also is that when we derive these models, as I'll just show you next, these models are quantitative models. They're not descriptive models. They're quantitative models, and that means that we can then formally analyze these models with tools to be able to look at similarities and differences. So this is a formal quantitative analysis as opposed to a subjective qualitative description of facial expressions, etc. So this gives us a lot of leverage actually to analyze these signals in all kinds of different ways. So I'll just explain here really what I mean. So each facial expression model is really a representation of the individual face movements, these action units, which are correlated with a participant's response. So if the eye whites were present and they said fear very often, there'd be a correlation between the two. So each facial expression model that we derive is a binary vector. So it's zeros and ones, where if the action unit doesn't have a relationship with response, it's off, it's a zero. If it does have a relationship with a given response, it will be on, it will be coded as a one, as shown here. Now, for each individual action unit that is associated with response, we also derive its movements. So each of these are represented with a real value between 0 and 1, essentially. So we have here on the right-hand side, you can see a representation of the dynamic movement that we might model of a given action unit. So when in time it peaks, it reaches its peak amplitude, and how quickly it fades, etc. Those kind of things, acceleration. So we model all of these temporal parameters from the responses of the participant to allow us to build a dynamic, quantitative model of a facial expression of emotion. Okay, so this then enables us to analyze the models, a formal analysis of the models. So here what we have is a matrix of binary vectors, just ones and zeros. The ones in white here represent the action units that are associated with the responses. The responses are at the side. And you can see here we have lots of individual observer models in happy. So each row is a model that we derive from an individual participant. So you can see a lot of internal consistency, for example, with some action units, within a category. Also allows us to understand which action units are shared across emotion categories. Of course, across participants or across cultures, it's always just the same principle. So you can see here with surprise and fear, I've outlined, this is an action unit upper lid raiser. So this is really showing the eye whites. And you can see here in white, it's very common in surprise. It's also very common in fear. You can also see it's a little bit in anger. You do have a little bit of eye whites in anger. So we can formally isolate the specific action units that are shared, say, across different emotion categories. Similarly, if we move to brow lowerer, which is the frown, basically, we can see that this is not shared across fear and surprise, but it is shared across, say, fear and sad. You can see that there's more white in fear and more in sad here. So here we can really understand the sort of latent expressive patterns across emotion categories, but equally across cultures. We can use the same formal approach. Oh yes, this is just in contrast. The lip corner puller, which is the smile, at least within these 6 categories, is almost exclusively associated with happy. Okay, so usually when one has this kind of data set, usually the data are kind of analyzed in a global fashion, but the analyses that we use goes beyond a global measurement. So some of you might be familiar with a figure such as this. This is a figure that shows really a global measure of similarity between these individual facial expression models. So you're really taking the 2 binary vectors and measuring how similar they are. Reds suggest that they're very similar. Blues show that they are not similar at all. So you can see, for example, internal consistency here. However, this particular approach, it gives a global measure, which is great, but it doesn't tell you how they're similar. So we might find some dissimilarities between disgust and anger, but it doesn't tell us how, which action units are common. It doesn't go to that level of precision. But because we have an individual action unit based analysis, we can, of course, specifically isolate which action units are common and different across categories or cultures. And this is a very the cognitive sciences, particularly with respect to categorical perception, is that if two things are similar, how are they similar? There's lots of ways something can be similar, lots of ways things can be different, but we want to know, how are they similar? How are they different? And so the methods that we use, both at the modelling stage and at the analysis of the modelling stage, allows us to specifically isolate what is similar, what is different. Okay, so that's the basis of the data-driven reverse. It's called reverse correlation. It's a data-driven method which agnostically samples face information. So the experimenter is agnostic, and then we use the participant. We ask the participant to choose amongst all of these which ones are meaningful to them. We then build robust models from these, which are quantitative, and then we can analyze these models to discover similarities and differences in facial expressions across cultures, but across different categories and so on as well. So we've used then this data-driven method to expand and advance knowledge of facial expressions beyond their cultural, beyond their traditional boundaries, beyond the classic six, beyond emotions as well, looking at different social messages and using this across different cultures. One of the great benefits of using this agnostic approach, of course, is with different cultures, because our own intuitions as an experimenter might not be very useful. So this is a really powerful method to objectively examine facial expressions, particularly across cultures where, you know, we might not have much knowledge or intuition can't really guide us there. So what I would like to do now is to run through some of the main results from the lab using this method. I should also point out there's a postdoctoral position and a PhD available, post available in the lab associated with this ERC project. Okay, so I would also just like to highlight something important, is that we're really interested in cultural variance and commonalities. We want to know the full picture rather than just one or the other. And so I'll show you some results which speak to cultural variance, but also cultural commonalities. Okay, so the first study is looking at cultural variance. This was a study that we did in 2012, where we modelled facial expressions of the six basic emotions, six classic emotions in East Asian culture and Western culture. And what we found is that there is a lot more expressivity or expressive variance in the eyes for in the East Asian models. So, for example, between disgust and anger, the eyes would express in different ways. Sometimes the eyes would be squeezed, the other times the eyes would be wide open. So there's a lot more variance in the eyes with the East Asian models. Now, with the Western models, we found this expressive variance more in the mouth region. So this is just a really basic illustration to show that with the method we can really get to some of the nuances of the signals and identifying what is similar and different across cultures. And here we found that the location of expressivity was different across the different cultures. And these results actually very nicely mirrored the emoticons that are used in different cultures. So you can see here, these are emoticons for happy in the top row and sad in the bottom row. And so what you'll see here for the East Asian emoticons is that the mouth is minimized and it's the eyes that are expressive. That's what the change in these emoticons is, that they change the eyes. And that is what we found in the facial expression models, that the eyes were more expressively variant. Now, of course, we found the opposite pattern in the Westerners. Most of you will be familiar with these smileys or sad faces where the eyes stay the same. The eyes largely stay the same in Western emoticons, and it's really the mouth that tends to vary to express different emotions. Okay, so in a follow-up study to this, so we looked at the 6 classic emotions before. As I mentioned to you earlier, there's a lot of other different emotions that we need to model and understand. And so if we are going to understand cultural commonalities and differences, it does make sense to expand investigation beyond the 6 classic. And so that is exactly what we did here. We modeled the facial expressions of over 60 different emotions in 2 cultures. So that's about a 10-fold increase from previous studies. To derive these models, remember that each facial expression is represented as a binary vector, something that we can formally analyze. And so what we did is we took these facial expression models and we used a data reduction technique to identify any latent expressive patterns. So which are the core expressive patterns that might structure facial expressions? And so what we found is we found 4 rather than 6. This is why the paper is called 4, not 6. We found 4 core sort of latent expressive patterns that subtend this wide variety of different facial expressions of emotion. So we found that each of these expressive patterns, which were common across both cultures, each one corresponds to emotions that have a specific valence and or arousal. So you can see on the leftmost facial expression pattern, this expressive pattern is almost exclusively associated with positive valence emotions such as happy, delighted, excited, and so on. Now the rightmost facial expression pattern, this is almost exclusively associated with negative high arousal emotions such as hate, disgust, and rage. Now, what does this mean? So this means that each of these individual facial expressions of emotions that we modeled, such as ecstatic here, is a combination of these 4 expressive patterns, a weighted combination of each of these 4 expressive patterns, such that each one has a core pattern, such as this high arousal pattern here for ecstatic, and then it has an accent to refine the meaning. So this is an accent from the positive valence expression pattern. So the main weight is in the first one, and then we have a smaller weight from this positive valence as an accent. So here, what we discovered, and trying to find what's common across cultures and how are facial expressions structured, do they have a systematic structure in the signaling? We found 4, not 6, latent expressive patterns, which each are associated with these very broad signals of valence and arousal, and that they combine together with different weights. They combine together in different ways to generate a very wide range of complex facial expressions, such as delighted, irritated, grief, and so on. So here what we found is really a systematic structure which is common across cultures and is really based on these 4 distinct expressive patterns. Another outcome of a study like this, when we modeled so many different sort of nuanced facial expressions, is a demonstration of the sensitivity and precision of the method that we used, such that it can accurately model facial expressions of very precise or nuanced emotions such as shame, pride, embarrassment, heartbroken, and so on. All of the models that we generated, we built using this approach, are always validated with an external group of participants from the same culture, so we know that they're recognizable and they're valid. And so this method is very, very powerful for modeling very precise, nuanced signals, social signals. All right, so as mentioned before, also, or as illustrated before, facial expressions are dynamic. They're not static. And so we really need to be able to, in understanding facial expressions, we really need to be able to understand their dynamics, whether they have a temporal structure, how does timing and dynamics contribute to facial expression communication? What is its role, etc.? And so because we build dynamic models, right, our stimuli are dynamic and therefore the models are dynamic, because we derive these, we can then analyze the temporal dynamics of the models in a systematic way. So this is exactly what we did in a 2014 study. So we individual facial expression models across the 6 classic emotions. This was just in Western culture for this paper, and we used a combination of information theory and Bayesian classifiers to formally analyze the temporal order of the action units and try to understand if there is a temporal structure, why does it have a temporal structure? So the first thing is that we did actually find a systematic temporal structuring of these face movements. So here we found with fear and surprise, this is an illustration, fear and surprise, we found that early in the signaling dynamics, the fear and surprise both transmitted the eye whites. So this is a shared action unit between fear and surprise, and it's transmitted at the same time. And that means that at that given moment in time, fear and surprise are confused. You can't tell the difference between the two because they're both transmitting the same information, basically. Now, later in the signaling dynamics, what we found is that then they each transmit a totally different action unit. So in a surprise here, we have the brow raiser, and then in fear, it's this lip stretcher. So even the action units are they're segmented in the face. They're in different parts of the face. So only later in the signaling dynamics, when these completely different action units are signaled, this is when surprise and fear can be distinguished. Now recall also that fear and surprise are supposed to be basic emotions. And if they were very basic, we might expect them to be signaled very clearly, very early on. But we find that that's only really possible later in the signaling dynamics. Now we also find the same pattern for disgust and anger. So here they both signal the nose wrinkler early in the signaling dynamics, meaning they get confused. And then they each signal different action units at the end, this upper lip raiser left, and then the upper lid raiser, which I referred to earlier for anger. This is the eye whites. So again, we have this very specific temporal structure of the transmission of action units, which enable some of the categories to be distinguished or not, as is the case in the early signaling dynamics. Okay, so delving in a bit deeper into this temporal structuring of these signals, we find that there's a systematic temporal structuring to it. So if we look a little bit more into this, what we did in this recent study, we examined the information that is being transmitted to action units. So again, this is with the 6 classic emotions. And we're building a relationship between the action units and the participant's response with respect to the emotion category, like happy or sad, or its intensity. So is it a low intensity happy? Did the person perceive it to be high intensity? So again, we're building a relationship between a stimulus and a response, simply. Now, some of the action units may also transmit both information, which is represented in this Venn diagram here. So we identified action units that either transmit the emotion category, the intensity, or both bits of information. And so what we found is that these action unit types were also temporally segmented. So we looked at the distribution of these action units over time, and we found that they were systematically temporally distinct. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this. So here we have happy, and you'll see, if you look very closely, we'll see some temporal segmentation of the action units for the intensifiers and classifiers. So we have the eye whites first, and then the smile. So now in this category, the eye whites are the intensifiers. So this is an action unit that tells the person, this is an intense emotion. Then we have the smile. The smile for this category is really representing the emotion category. It's saying, this is a happy person. So you can see the eye whites come first, and then we have the smile. So intensity first, and then the emotion category. Okay. So I'm going to now switch to another example, which is anger, where we find the opposite order. We still find temporal segmentation, we find the opposite order, different action units, of course. So here we have anger. So we have the nose wrinkler, and then we have the wide open mouth and the eye whites. Now the nose wrinkler for anger is transmitting the category anger. It's telling the person this is an angry emotion. The eye whites in the mouth are highly associated with intensity. So the category comes first, the intensity information comes later. So nose wrinkler followed by wide open mouth and the eye whites. So again, we have a clear temporal segmentation of this information that transmits different types of information in a different way. We did also find this temporally segmented pattern in both cultures. So we know that this is a common pattern across cultures. So this means that we can use this method to understand then how different action units are transmitted over time, but also what information those different action units are transmitting to the participant. And here what we're finding is that the action units are arranged in a particular way to provide the observer with a cascade of information over time, which could aid cognitive processing. If information is temporally structured in a expected or predicted way, and it's not presented all at one time, this could aid cognitive processing. Okay, so I've shown you quite a lot about how we've used this method to look at facial expressions of emotion. But as mentioned before, there's a lot of other social messages that facial expressions can transmit. A lot more emotions, but definitely a lot more outside of emotions. So conversational facial expressions like interested, bored, and confused, these are used much more daily than your usual set of emotions. So here what we did is that we modeled facial expressions of these conversational messages, and then we analyzed the models. We built models in two cultures, East Asian culture and Western culture. And then what we're able to do is that we can directly and formally compare the facial expression signals to specifically isolate the face movements that are culturally common and those which are specific. So the action units or the face movements that are the same across cultures are in red, and those that are different across cultures are in blue. So you can see here that interested and bored are basically the same. Their facial expressions are very similar, and that if we use these facial expressions across cultures, there is excellent agreement. So there's excellent communication. Transmitting bored and interested, there's no confusion there. However, when we look at interested, we find, again, systematic differences in these facial expression signals, and this is largely located in the mouth region. So you can see here, the Western models have more of this lateral mouth stretch, whereas the East Asian models of confused have more of this very wide sort of gaping mouth movement. Now, if we then take our facial expression models and we try to use them in a cross-cultural context, we do find that there's confusion. So Westerners don't really recognize the East Asian facial expressions of confused and vice versa. So rather ironically, if you like, conveying confusion across cultures just causes more confusion. And in fact, I had a PhD student who's East Asian who used to make this facial expression, and I never really understood what it meant. And then when we got those results, I was like, oh, this is the face you used to make. And I knew it wasn't good. I knew what it meant, that something was wrong, but I could never really figure out what it meant. But now we know what it means. Okay, so here we're really going beyond emotions. We're trying to understand much more about everyday conversational facial expressions and how these can create barriers, communication barriers potentially across cultures, and which ones can facilitate non-verbal communication. We also did a study relatively recently on pain and pleasure, again across cultures, and we found that pain expressions are very similar across cultures, whereas pleasure had some cultural accents. Again, we were able to specifically isolate which action units are similar, which ones are different. Okay, so I've given you a rundown of just some of the main results from the lab using this technique, which hopefully has illustrated to you how we can use this then to expand knowledge of facial expressions beyond 6 emotions, beyond emotions, and to be able to use this technique in different cultures to build very rich, dynamic, and objectively derived models of facial expressions in different cultures, which then enables us to perform precise analyses so that we can really get to understand what is the sort of code of facial expression communication, what is the language, how do we combine these different action units together to create words and sentences in different cultures, and are these meaningful across different cultures? And of course, when we use this kind of information together, when we have these models, these quantitative models, we can use this wealth of knowledge then to build a generative model of social face signaling, a kind of a broader generative model of social face signaling generally, which can then inform theories of psychological theories of communication. But it can also mean that we can use this to inform the design of digital agents. So digital agents need some kind of recipe book. They need to be told which combination of action units and how do we combine them, what temporal order, which intensity, what sustainment, etc. They need a quantitative model to be able to do that. And so the models that we derive can then be directly applied to the design of socially interactive digital agents. And we have done some work on this recently. So when we transfer our models to a range of digital agents, what we found is that we, first of all, can increase recognition accuracy in different cultures, because digital agents are largely equipped with these standardized static facial expressions, which we know are not universally recognized. And so when we equip digital agents with our models derived in different cultures, the agents are then recognized in these cultures by these cultures. And so this potentially can increase their global marketability. In providing nuanced dynamic facial expression models, we can also increase perceptions of human likeness and realism. Of course, we have made them more culturally diverse, so they can generate Western facial expressions, they can generate East Asian facial expressions, and of course we've developed or broadened their repertoire of social signaling capabilities, so not just the 6 classic emotions, but also conversational signals and so on. Okay, so finally, so I've talked a lot about facial expressions, the movements that the face can make, but faces come in all kinds of different shapes, colours, and textures. And every person ever born, which is about 106 billion people or something like this, every person ever born has had a different face, and their face has changed across their lifetime. So faces really come in a really wide variety of shapes and colours and so on. And all of this additional information of the face can impact social perception. It can change the way we interpret facial expressions. So having then refined the technique that we're using here, which is agnostically generating different facial expressions and asking people to choose which ones relate to different social messages, we're now applying exactly the same principles to 3D face morphology. So essentially we are generating a wide range of different face shapes, asking people to choose which ones are trustworthy, attractive, and so on, and then building models from their responses. We're also applying it to complexion. So this is essentially the skin tone, but also the texture of the skin. And we do this then to build an algebraic model, if you like, of face movements, morphology, and complexion, so that we can have a comprehensive model of social face signaling that understands the interactions of this different information space. Each one, of course, is a very large information space, and so we apply the technique to each one individually before combining the resulting models together and testing how they interact. The method that we use here, also, it's important to point out the method that we use here, is a generic approach. So it can be applied in principle to any objectively measurable stimulus space. So here we've been applying it to face movements, action units, face shape, which is, everything is measurable. But it can also be applied to auditory signals, so voice, for example. It can also be applied to body shape, body movements. In principle, it could be applied to things like odor. If you can measure odor, then you can generate different stimuli, and then you can capture participants' responses to that stimulus. So it's a generic method that can be used in a very, very broad way. Okay, I would just like to run also through a couple of developments, additions to the platform. And so we already have face movements, we have face shape and complexion. Eye gaze is, of course, really important, and so we have added this component to the generative model. We also have transient changes in the face, like blushing and pallor, which can represent different things to do with health, but also different emotional states like embarrassment or anger. And so again, we've added this as an addition to the face generation platform we have. We can also generate faces of different ages and so on. So again, this is just having a very nuanced generation platform to represent different ages, ethnicities, and so on. We also have a wide range of lighting models as well to look at how lighting might affect perception. We also have head movements, okay, nodding, things like that, shaking the head, all very important, all important for social communication, and all rather different across cultures, as most of us probably know. I'll just skip this bit and go into this. So another thing we can do is that we can create super stimuli, because of course we have everything is based on real people, but we have control, so we can make super stimuli. So we can study more super stimuli within a traditional communication sort of context, and that means that we can create super stimuli that we can then equip digital agents with, so that they can have super clear communication, say, across different distances that humans just can't do, but digital agents can do oftentimes a lot more than what humans can do. We can also do very weird things like this, just for fun. This makes me feel a bit sick, actually. I'll just skip this. This is really just showing the generative capacity of different identities. None of these are real people. They're all just random identities that we've generated. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. Thanks to all the funders and collaborators, of course, and very happy to take questions now. Thanks.